Venezuela's economic collapse stands as one of the most dramatic examples of how a series of poor policy decisions can transform a wealthy nation into an economic disaster zone. In the 1970s, Venezuela boasted the highest GDP per capita in Latin America, fueled by massive oil reserves that seemed to promise endless prosperity. Today, the country faces hyperinflation that has rendered its currency virtually worthless, widespread shortages of basic goods, and mass emigration of millions of citizens seeking better lives abroad. This transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it the result of a single catastrophic event. Instead, it was the cumulative effect of 5 fundamental economic mistakes that any country, regardless of its initial wealth or resources, could potentially make. Understanding these mistakes offers valuable lessons for nations around the world about the importance of economic diversification, fiscal discipline, and sound governance. The first critical mistake was the complete dependence on a single commodity, oil. Venezuela sits atop some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and for decades this seemed like an unbeatable advantage. The government allowed oil revenues to account for roughly 95% of export earnings and about half of the federal budget. This created a dangerous situation where the entire economy rose and fell with global oil prices. When oil prices were high in the early 2000s, money flooded into government coffers, creating an illusion of limitless wealth. But economies built on a single export are fundamentally unstable because they're vulnerable to price shocks beyond their control. Other oil-rich nations like Norway and the United Arab Emirates understood this risk and invested heavily in diversifying their economies, building up manufacturing, technology, tourism and financial services sectors. Venezuela did the opposite, actually allowing its non-oil industries to atrophy as cheap imports flooded in during boom times. When oil prices inevitably crashed in 2014, the country had no economic cushion to fall back on, no alternative industries to generate revenue or employment. The collapse was swift and brutal because the entire economic structure rested on a single, unstable pillar. The second devastating mistake was the reckless expansion of government spending without regard for fiscal sustainability. When oil prices were high, the Venezuelan government dramatically increased social spending, subsidies, and public sector employment. These programs were politically popular and initially seemed affordable given the flood of petrodollars. However, the government made a fatal assumption that high oil prices would continue indefinitely. Instead of saving surplus revenues during good times to prepare for inevitable downturns, as countries like Chile and Norway did with their sovereign wealth funds, Venezuela spent every dollar and more. The government took on significant debt, assuming future oil revenues would cover it. Public sector employment ballooned, with the government becoming the employer of last resort for millions of Venezuelans. Subsidies on fuel, food, and other goods became so extensive that they consumed huge portions of the budget. When oil revenues collapsed, the government faced an impossible choice: either drastically cut spending and face social unrest, or continue spending money it didn't have. It chose the latter, leading directly to the next catastrophic mistake. The third mistake was resorting to printing money to finance government deficits, triggering hyperinflation that destroyed the currency and savings of ordinary citizens. Unable to borrow money on international markets due to declining creditworthiness and unwilling to make painful spending cuts, the Venezuelan government turned to the printing press. The central bank began creating massive amounts of new currency to cover government expenses, pay public sector salaries, and maintain subsidies. This is perhaps the most predictable economic disaster in history. Every single time a government has printed unlimited money to finance spending, hyperinflation has followed. Basic economic principles show that when the money supply grows much faster than the production of goods and services, each unit of currency becomes worth less. In Venezuela's case, the inflation rate reached astronomical levels, exceeding 1,000,000% at its peak. People's life savings evaporated overnight. A person who had carefully saved the equivalent of $10,000 might wake up to find it would barely buy a loaf of bread. Prices changed not just daily but hourly, making any kind of economic planning impossible. Businesses couldn't set prices. Workers saw their wages become worthless before they could spend them, and the entire monetary system essentially ceased to function. The bolivar became so worthless that people literally threw bills in the street because they weren't worth the effort to pick up. The fourth catastrophic decision was implementing extensive price controls and nationalizing private businesses, destroying the country's productive capacity. Faced with shortages and inflation, the government responded with what seemed like a logical solution. If prices are too high, simply mandate lower prices by law. Price controls were imposed on everything from food to toilet paper, with the government setting prices well below market rates. The predictable result was that businesses couldn't afford to produce goods at the mandated prices, leading to widespread shortages. When store shelves emptied, the government blamed private companies and foreign conspiracies rather than its own policies. The response was to nationalize businesses across multiple sectors: oil services, agriculture, manufacturing, retail, banking. The government seized thousands of private companies, farms, and factories. However, running a successful business requires expertise, efficient management, and proper incentives, things that politically appointed government managers typically lack. The nationalized companies became bloated, inefficient, and corrupt. Production plummeted across industries. Farms that once produced abundant crops fell into disrepair. Factories closed or operated at a fraction of capacity. The nationalization of the oil industry was particularly destructive. PDVSA, the state oil company, saw its production fall from over 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to less than 500,000 barrels by 2020. This wasn't due to depleted reserves, but to mismanagement, lack of investment, and politicization of the company. The destruction of productive capacity meant that even if other policies were fixed, the economy had lost its ability to produce goods and generate wealth. The fifth and final mistake was undermining property rights, rule of law, and democratic institutions, driving away investment and talent while entrenching corruption. Economic development requires a stable framework where people can invest, start businesses, and plan for the future with confidence that the rules won't arbitrarily change. Venezuela systematically destroyed this framework. Property rights became meaningless when the government could seize businesses, farms, or assets at will without fair compensation. The judiciary lost its independence, becoming a tool for political control rather than impartial arbitration. Contracts meant nothing when the government could unilaterally change terms or refuse to honor agreements. Foreign companies that had invested billions in Venezuela saw their assets confiscated, sending a clear message to other potential investors. Meanwhile, corruption flourished as government officials used their positions to enrich themselves, siphoning off what remained of the country's wealth. Capital flight accelerated as anyone with money sought to move it to safer countries. Brain drain followed as educated, skilled Venezuelans emigrated in search of better opportunities. Over 6 million people, roughly 20% of the population, have fled Venezuela since the crisis began, one of the largest refugee exoduses in modern history. These weren't just numbers, but doctors, engineers, teachers, entrepreneurs, the very people needed to rebuild a functioning economy. Without property rights, rule of law, and stable institutions, economic recovery becomes nearly impossible because no one wants to invest time, money, or effort in a system where everything can be arbitrarily taken away. The interconnected nature of these mistakes amplified their destructive power. Dependence on oil made the economy vulnerable to price shocks. Excessive spending created deficits that led to money printing. Money printing caused hyperinflation. Inflation prompted price controls and nationalization. Nationalization destroyed productive capacity. The breakdown of institutions prevented any course correction and drove away the resources needed for recovery. Each mistake made the next one more likely and more damaging. What's particularly striking is that none of these were secret risks or unforeseeable consequences. Economists warned against oil dependence for decades. The dangers of deficit spending were well known. The link between printing money and inflation is one of the most established principles in economics. Price controls have failed repeatedly throughout history. The importance of property rights and rule of law for economic development is thoroughly documented. Yet Venezuela's leadership pursued these policies anyway, often driven by political considerations, ideological beliefs, or short-term thinking that ignored long-term consequences. The human cost of these economic mistakes has been staggering. Malnutrition rates have soared as food became scarce and unaffordable. Hospitals lack basic medicines and equipment, leading to preventable deaths. Crime rates exploded as desperate people turned to theft and violence. The social fabric of the country has been torn apart, with families separated by emigration and communities hollowed out as people flee. An entire generation has lost opportunities for education, career development, and normal life experiences. The psychological trauma of watching your country collapse around you, of seeing your life savings become worthless, of being unable to feed your family despite working multiple jobs. This creates deep scars that persist long after any economic recovery might begin. Children growing up during this crisis have known nothing but shortages, instability, and hardship, shaping their worldview and future prospects in profound ways. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity to Venezuela's crisis. As the economy collapsed, the country became increasingly dependent on support from allies like China, Russia, and Cuba, often trading away future oil revenues for immediate financial assistance. This created new forms of dependency and limited the government's freedom of action. International sanctions, particularly from the United States, further complicated the situation, restricting Venezuela's access to international financial markets and oil revenues. While sanctions were intended to pressure the government to change course, they also imposed additional hardships on ordinary citizens. The question of whether external pressure helps or hurts in such situations remains contentious, with valid arguments on both sides. What's clear is that once a country enters such a deep crisis, external factors can significantly influence the trajectory, making recovery even more challenging. Recovery from this level of economic destruction is extraordinarily difficult and typically takes decades even under the best circumstances. The physical infrastructure has deteriorated from lack of maintenance and investment. The industrial base has been dismantled. The skilled workforce has emigrated. Trust in institutions has been destroyed. Hyperinflation has eliminated savings and working capital. Foreign investment has fled and won't return without major reforms and guarantees. Even if a new government committed to sound economic policies took power tomorrow, rebuilding would be a monumental task. Countries that have recovered from hyperinflation and economic collapse, like Germany after World War I, Bolivia in the 1980s, or Zimbabwe more recently, have required years of painful adjustment, strict fiscal discipline, currency reforms, and often substantial international assistance. The social and political challenges are equally daunting. Populations that have suffered such trauma often become deeply skeptical of any government and resistant to necessary reforms that might involve short-term pain for long-term gain. The Venezuela example offers crucial lessons for other nations, particularly those blessed and cursed with natural resource wealth. The first lesson is the critical importance of economic diversification. Resource wealth should be seen as a temporary advantage to be used for building a more diverse and resilient economy, not as a permanent solution. Countries need to invest heavily in education, infrastructure, manufacturing, and services, while commodity prices are high, creating alternative sources of growth and employment. The second lesson is the necessity of fiscal discipline and saving during good times. Budget surpluses during boom periods should be saved in sovereign wealth funds or used to pay down debt, creating buffers for inevitable downturns. The third lesson is that printing money to finance government spending is never a sustainable solution and always ends in disaster. Governments must live within their means or find legitimate ways to borrow. The fourth lesson is that price controls and nationalization consistently fail to achieve their stated goals and instead destroy productive capacity. Market mechanisms, properly regulated, are far more effective at allocating resources and encouraging production. The fifth lesson is that strong institutions, property rights, and rule of law are fundamental prerequisites for economic development and must be protected even during crises. These lessons extend beyond the just resource-rich countries. Any nation can fall into similar traps through different paths. Excessive government spending financed by borrowing or printing money can lead to inflation and currency crises, as seen in Zimbabwe, Argentina, and numerous other countries throughout history. Protectionist policies and government control of industries have repeatedly failed to generate prosperity, from the Soviet Union to many post-colonial experiments in state-led development. The undermining of democratic institutions and rule of law invariably leads to corruption, capital flight, and economic stagnation, as demonstrated in countless countries across different continents and political systems. The specific details vary, but the fundamental dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Governments that ignore basic economic principles and prioritize short-term political gains over long-term stability inevitably create crises that harm the very people they claim to help. The political dimension cannot be ignored because economic policies don't emerge in a vacuum. They reflect political choices, ideologies, and power structures. In Venezuela's case, policies were often justified using populist rhetoric about helping the poor, fighting imperialism, and creating a more equal society. These goals themselves may be admirable, but the methods chosen to achieve them produce the opposite results: increased poverty, greater dependency on foreign powers, and massive inequality as connected elites enriched themselves while ordinary people suffered. This pattern repeats across history, where good intentions combined with bad policies create catastrophic outcomes. The challenge for democratic societies is creating systems where leaders face accountability for long-term results, not just short-term popularity. This requires educated citizens who understand basic economic principles, independent institutions that can check government power, and media that can scrutinize policies rather than simply amplify political messaging. Venezuela's tragedy also highlights the difficulty of reversing course once these mistakes begin to compound. Each bad decision creates constituencies who benefit from it and resist change, while those harmed often lack the power to force corrections. Government employees resist cuts to public sector jobs. Recipients of subsidies oppose their removal. Corrupt officials fight reforms that would expose their theft. Nationalized industries create bureaucratic empires that defend their turf. Meanwhile, the productive sectors of society that might push for better policies have been weakened or destroyed. This creates a political economy trap where bad policies become self-reinforcing even as they destroy the overall economy. Breaking out of such traps typically requires either a severe crisis that makes change unavoidable, external pressure that shifts the balance of power, or exceptional political leadership willing to take on entrenched interests. Unfortunately, the worse the crisis becomes, the harder it is to implement necessary reforms because the social fabric has been damaged, trust has evaporated, and people become desperate for any immediate relief rather than patient with long-term solutions. The comparison to other resource-rich countries illuminates how different choices produce different outcomes. Norway discovered major oil reserves around the same time as Venezuela, but took a fundamentally different approach. The Norwegian government created a sovereign wealth fund that saved and invested oil revenues for future generations, rather than spending everything immediately. It maintained a diverse economy with strong non-oil sectors. It preserved democratic institutions, property rights, and rule of law. It practiced fiscal discipline even when oil revenues were high. Today, Norway's sovereign wealth fund is worth over $1 trillion, more than $200,000 per citizen, while maintaining one of the world's highest standards of living and most stable economies. The contrast with Venezuela couldn't be starker, yet both started with similar advantages. The difference was governance and policy choices, not geography or resources. This demonstrates that resource wealth is neither a blessing nor a curse in itself. It's how societies manage that wealth that determines outcomes. For countries currently facing similar risks, Venezuela's example should serve as a stark warning. Any nation overly dependent on commodity exports should urgently prioritize diversification. Governments running persistent deficits should implement fiscal reforms before crisis forces painful emergency measures. Countries with rising inflation should address root causes rather than resorting to price controls or printing money. Nations considering nationalization should study the overwhelming historical evidence of failure. Any place where institutions are weakening or property rights eroding should recognize the long-term economic costs. The time to make corrections is before crisis hits, when options remain available and adjustments can be gradual rather than catastrophic. Once a country enters the spiral that Venezuela experienced, escape becomes exponentially more difficult. Prevention is infinitely easier than cure when it comes to economic collapse. Looking forward, Venezuela's recovery will depend on fundamental policy reversals and institutional rebuilding, but the path forward remains uncertain and contested. The country will need to restore property rights and rule of law to attract investment. It must implement strict fiscal discipline and resist the temptation to print money. Price controls need to be eliminated to allow markets to function. Nationalized industries should be privatized or at least professionally managed. Most importantly, the economy needs to be diversified away from oil dependence, though this will be challenging given the deteriorated state of non-oil industries. Beyond economics, Venezuela needs political reconciliation, governance reforms, and social healing after years of polarization and conflict. The international community's role in supporting or hindering this process will be significant, as will the actions of other countries in the region. Some nations may learn from Venezuela's mistakes, while others may repeat them. The ongoing crisis serves as a real-time experiment in how economic mistakes can destroy prosperity and what it takes to rebuild, offering lessons that will remain relevant for decades to come, regardless of how Venezuela's specific situation evolves.